I've seen guys who looked like Superman absolutely crumble under a ruck. And it wasn't because they were too weak, but because they weren't prepared for the specific demands of carrying a pack. So in this video, I'm gonna detail everything you need to succeed under a ruck. All right, so first off, what is rucking? Rucking is just carrying a pack often over varied terrain. And how does that differ from backpacking? Well, from a physical standpoint, not a whole lot, but the big difference between rucking and backpacking is the speed that you're going to have to do it. When you're going to a military course, you're going to have to move a lot faster, you're going to have time standards, and usually a lot more equipment than you would experience when you're backpacking. Now, what are the standards that we are shooting for when we are building up our ruck capacity? Well, for those training for special forces or special operations in general, we typically like to see a sub 2 hour and 30-minute 12-mile ruck, which is a 12:30 per mile pace, which means you're absolutely going to have to run with a ruck. And what does it take to get there? Well, there's 4 things that really drive up someone's performance under a ruck. The first is endurance capacity or aerobic conditioning, kind of like what we talked about in the running video if you haven't checked that one out. Strength, the ability to carry 55 to 75 plus pounds. In operations in Afghanistan, sometimes we were carrying over 100 pounds. If you go out to Robin Sage, your pack is going to be about 130 pounds plus. So you need the strength to be able to move the weight. Then specific conditioning, so impact resistance and foot conditioning are absolutely key. And then lastly, strategy, packing, pacing, and fueling. And in this video, we're going to cover all of these things so you have a clear understanding of how to drive up your performance. And first things first, driving into endurance capacity. For this, it is absolutely crucial to build your weekly mileage before trying to just ramp into rucking. One of the biggest issues we see with guys getting into the military, getting into special forces selection, going this route is just strapping a heavy pack on and trying to go as many miles as they can, developing a lot of injuries, developing a lot of setbacks, or underperforming when it comes to running as well. So for military, especially guys going to SFAS or similar courses, focus your run times first. Drive up your weekly mileage gradually so you can run 15, 20, 25 miles per week pain-free. And the goals that we want to hit before really focusing fully on rucking is a 2 mile in sub 13:30 and a 5 mile in sub 37. That's going to be an indication that, one, we're going to be able to pass the initial PT test and even make it to the ruck marches, and then we have really good impact resistance and endurance capacity to perform well under a ruck. During this time, we can build our ruck conditioning primarily by including some walking only rucks. So the reason we want to focus walking only rucks and we don't just go out there crushing ourselves with a ruck run every single week is because we want to keep the fatigue down. We want to use that bandwidth to put towards running, getting those run times down. We don't want to beat up our connective tissues, which, like you'll find out later, does take a little bit longer to adapt, and we want to get time under load to get the stimulus that we need. So if you have slower run times, you're not at that 13:30 or 37 5-mile mark, then we want to do every other week rucking, especially if you're further out from going to selection. Use that to build up your long zone 2 runs, ideally getting to that 90-minute sustained movement mark. If you are fast and you do have these numbers with your 2 and 5 mile runs, then we can do a weekly ruck, or if you're getting closer, we can do 2 rucks per week, one of those being longer and slower, and then one of those focusing on intervals as well. And then the biggest thing with rucking is to gradually increase the weight and distance. We don't want to do both at the same time, and we don't want to just jump into heavy mileage, even if we come from a fitness background and we're really fit, because the connective tissue, like I said, takes a little bit of time. And we want to stair step the distance and the weight. We don't want to increase both at once. So let's say one week we increase the mileage, next week we increase the weight while keeping the mileage the same, then the following week we increase the mileage again, and so on, so forth. Stair step up the stimulus that we're putting on our system. Next is strength. This is important. Like I said, we need to have the ability to carry heavy packs and additional equipment. For this, we like to lift 2 to 4 times per week. And a lot of guys might ask, why do we lift? Some old, usually like the boomers that say, oh, back in my day, I just carried a pack and did push-ups and sit-ups. But they're also the ones that finish their career with lower back issues, instability in their hips, and a lot of injuries that could be prevented through lifting and getting the strength stimulus. So lifting is actually huge in regard to injury prevention. It strengthens our connective tissues, it increases bone density, it increases the muscles, it prevents us from having imbalances, especially in our hips that lead to breakdowns later on. So it drives up durability by going through those full ranges of motion, getting the different stimulus. And this is one thing that I always talk about with full range of motion is I guarantee you, when you go to selection, there is going to be a time where you're walking through the woods and you seemingly step off the face of the earth while walking with a pack in the middle of the night, unable to see anything. If you don't have the durability or the strength to withstand that force, it leads to a lot of injuries. And then lastly is power and performance. We're gonna be climbing hills, we're gonna be walking through sand, we're gonna be moving fast under a load. Lifting weights, building that power, especially in single leg and the posterior chain, which we'll touch on, is absolutely crucial. For this, we like to use two main frameworks. There's many out there and many of them will absolutely work, but what we have seen after training 400 plus tactical athletes is the 5-3-1 method and the tactical barbell are usually best for driving up systemic strength without creating so much damage to the muscle fibers or fatigue that it undermines run times, undermines ruck performance. So with this, we want to keep it sub-maximal, meaning we're not crushing ourselves, taking every set to failure through every single week. I can do an entire video on these two and how we implement them in a plan, but the goal is to drive up the systemic strength with those big movements in higher rep ranges or higher percentages in relation to our 1 rep max to really get that strength stimulus. Next, we want to include things like GPP. So this can consist of sled work, this can consist of carries, this can consist of sustained work capacity sessions, and what this is going to do is drive up our fatigue resistance and get us working under fatigue, get us working under load. Then next, we want to make sure that we're covering down on the single leg work. We talk about the essential movement patterns for well-rounded individuals going to selection, but for ruck specifically, we want to have strong stability and strong power in that single leg movement, which is obviously going to transition very well to climbing hills under a pack. And then the biggest thing that we want to focus with rucking is going to be our posterior chain. Our posterior chain is everything on the back side of our body. So our back, also our spinal erectors, our glutes, our hamstrings, our calves, these are going to be the most important factor to being able to carry a pack and being able to perform well under a pack. Now going into specific conditioning, I've already said it multiple times because this is usually the one that gets guys in trouble, is your connective tissue is slower to progress than your musculature. Meaning if you come from a powerlifting background, if you are a strong dude, a lot of times what happens, or maybe you came from athletics, a lot of times what happens is guys hear that they have to do a 12-mile ruck, they strap a pack on, they go do that 12-mile ruck, and they end up with a lot of injuries, not in their musculature, but in their connective tissue. So we want to impose that stress gradually so we give our tissues a chance to progress. Next is going to be time under load. One of the big bonuses of focusing on walking only rucks while we're getting those run times is we usually have a little bit more time under load, which is going to get that stimulus, really work on our posterior chain, our spinal erectors, our ability to carry a pack, and our mental toughness because it's going to burn your shoulders. And then lastly is technique. When we're moving under a pack, we want to make sure that our legs are bent, kind of like the running video we put out last week. We want to keep those foot strikes under our center of mass, and we don't want to be locking out and putting additional weight on our knee. That's how we end up with issues such as IT band syndrome, pain in our knee that really prevents us from progressing with the rucks. Another part of specific conditioning is foot conditioning, and this is one of the biggest components to rucking in general. Most guys are pretty good under a ruck until they start having a blister, until they start losing toenails, and they freaking can't walk. So foot conditioning is huge, and the biggest part of foot conditioning is going to be prevention. Preventing the blisters, preventing the issues from ever happening in the first place. And one of the biggest components of preventing that is solid boot selection. And This is a question we get all the time. What boots do you recommend? What are the best boots out there? And to reiterate this, there is no universal best boot for everybody. There is a best boot for you. So I recommend trying out different boots. If you buy a boot, I know they cost like sometimes $180, $250. If you buy a boot and you get 5-10 rucks in it and it's absolutely just destroying your feet, get another boot. A lot of them have really good return policies, but sometimes guys are just too lazy to return them, so they just try to get through it with a pair of boots that doesn't fit them well. Find a boot that fits you well. These are some of the ones that I've used, some of the ones that a lot of our guys use. This is not an all-encompassing list. There's many more out there, but Garmont NFSs is usually one that a lot of guys work, but it will have a little bit of longer of a break-in period. OTB, they have the M Carbon 8s, which is a really good lightweight boot. We've had mixed reviews on the boot with guys using it out at team week and those heavier loads, but for gate week, for those timed rucks, absolutely fantastic boot. Go Ruck Mac V2s, much like the OTBs. Nike SFB, which is kind of that in between, not as good as their version 1 boot, but still pretty decent. Then the Rockies, and then my favorite is gonna be Loa's. However, these are not gonna be AR 670-1 standard, so you can't take them out to selection, can't use them if you are in an environment that you need to have them within regs. You can use them on a team though. Next is gonna be custom insoles. A lot of our guys might come in experiencing things like plantar fasciitis or other issues. They've swapped out multiple boots and they can't get the foot issues correct. So the next step is going to be getting fitted for custom insoles, which is going to be a lot of times huge in regard to solving those foot issues. And then foot glide / powder. This is like one of the biggest things. If I could go back to the start of my career when I was still having blisters and still, experiencing all that stuff, I wish I would have started using Foot Glide earlier. It's a freaking godsend. So using something like Foot Glide, some guys, like Tyler back here, likes to use foot powder instead, but test them out, find out what works best for you. Also, find out what the socks that work best with those boot sock combinations. Fox River, Darn Tough are some good ones, and you want to make sure that you have enough of that specific sock so you can use it throughout selection when you're not able to wash them regularly. And then for kind of prevention / treatment is moleskin and leukotape. Moleskin, a lot of times they have the rings cut out, or you can cut them out manually to make sure you have a little donut around those blisters or those hot spots that you continue to get. However, moleskin doesn't stick well as leukotape. So if you want to do some preventative treatment, have something on your heel where you get hot spots, leukotape is a good way to do it. Lastly is hygiene and daily care. When you're at selection, hygiene is freaking huge. Trim your toenails, wash your feet, keep the dirt and grime out of your blisters so they actually heal without getting infested or infected and creating a bigger issue than they need to be. So every night, the routine that I recommend you guys is take off your boots, take off your socks, let your feet air out, wipe them down with wet wipes or wash them in a shower if you're able to, and then elevate your feet for 5 to 10 minutes. When you're walking with a pack on your back for days at a time, all day long, you're gonna have a lot of swelling in your feet. So getting them elevated above your heart, even laying on the floor, putting your feet on a bunk is gonna be fantastic to clear out a lot of that inflammation. And then we have an entire foot conditioning or foot care guide below, so the link to that is down in the description if you wanna check it out. Next is strategy. Strategy is huge. So we have specific conditioning, we have the endurance capacity built up, we have the strength built up. Now we need to start implementing our strategy. And one of the biggest components to a solid strategy is packing the ruck. I did a ruck video a while back, and a lot of comments on it were from backpackers saying, hey, you need to put the weight low, you need to put the weight low. Well, there is a time and place for putting the weight low, but going into the military and going into timed rucks is not that place, because if we're going into a timed ruck, we don't want a lot of that stress on our hips. We would rather have it high and close to our shoulder blades as possible, which is gonna make it nice and balanced, and it'll make your shoulders scream a little bit more, but it's not gonna tire out your hips, which will actually slow you down on those rucks. If you're going with insane amount of weight or climbing hills in the backcountry, walking at a very slow pace with steep inclines, things like that, then yeah, you can move it down a little bit. But for military rucking, where a time standard is the goal, we want the weight as high and as close to our shoulder blades as possible. And kind of the way I want you guys to think about this is we want to start with a foundation. For me, I always use a sleeping bag as a foundation. It's big, it's bulky, but it's also light material. On each side of the sleeping bag, if I'm bringing, additional boots, you can put boots on the side to kind of create that foundation inside your ruck. Then on top of the foundation, we want to create a little bit of a shelf. A wet weather bag with some clothes, jackets, etc. is really good for this. Creates a lot of space, but it's also pretty light. So at the bottom of the ruck, we have the bulky but light material to create that foundation and the shelf. Then on top of that, we can have the heaviest items up high and as close to your shoulder blades as possible, meaning it's on the inside, it's not on the outside of the ruck, it's not shifted to one side, center and as close to your shoulder blades as possible. And then on the outside of that, we want filler material to hold that in place so it doesn't start working its way down or start working its way to the outside of the ruck. And then we want the entire ruck to be balanced left to right and forward and back. So make sure when you're putting the weight in there, it's not shifted to one side. If you're having a bunch of stuff in your sustainment pouches, one side is not disproportionately weighted from the other one. Going into the actual movements, fueling is going to be huge. There's been many guys I talked to who are like, hey, I didn't make it that far into a Norwegian ruck march. And then I start dissecting what their strategy was with it and realize that they had no fueling strategy. So fueling during the rucks is absolutely crucial. And during these rucks and long movements, we are primarily going to be pulling from glycogen, which is that sugar in our blood, primarily converted from carbohydrates. So we need to be fueling our body with carbohydrates during those movements. Now, a good rule of thumb for most people is about 60 to 70 grams of carbs per hour. Obviously depends on the size of the individual, the output, things like that. But for most average builds, 60 to 70 grams per hour of fast digesting carbohydrates. So think things like gels, chews, freaking my favorite Rice Krispie treats. I'm just kidding, but I do love Rice Krispie treats. So things that are going to be fast metabolizing and are going to be converted into that glycogen very quickly. We don't want to have things with a lot of fat or a lot of fiber, which is going to slow that digestion and not turn into glycogen as quickly as we want it to. Also, hydration is huge. Drink your freaking water. We should be drinking about 0.5 to 1 liter per hour of water, and with that, 400 to 800 milligrams of sodium. So some good ones that we like to use is Element, Drip Drop, Hoist, or my favorite, which is Tailwind. Tailwind has some carbohydrates built into it, has a decent electrolyte mixture. So those are all gonna be good, but make sure that you have carbohydrates, fast metabolizing carbohydrates, and water with electrolytes. Don't just flood your system with water without those electrolytes, or try to grunt out a ruck, a 3-hour ruck, 12 miler without fueling your body properly. And then this one is huge. Split test in training. A split test is where you intentionally try different things and you receive or you note down the data from it. Often used in business, but we can use it in training to figure out what works best for us. So things that we should be split testing is boot and sock combinations. We should be split testing whether we, foot glide or leukotape. We should be split testing the number of carbs per hour during different movements, the electrolytes that we are using. We should have those variables and play with them in training so we figure out what works best for you. Now, next part of strategy is going to be pacing. A big one that you're going to hear all the time in the military is, bro, just walk up the hills, run down the hills. And this is a sufficient pacing strategy for most courses that have kind of those rolling hill structures. I honestly didn't use it a whole lot. I'll talk about what I used, but with walk up, jog down, it's really good for test day. Don't be doing that all the time inside of training, because when you're jogging down hills, as you can imagine, with 50, 60 pounds on your back, moving, jumping and landing repetitively on a hill, you're gonna be putting a lot of stress on your system. So use that one on test day, get some stimulus with it a little bit prior to going in, but don't do that on a very consistent basis. The one that I like to use is kind of like a fartlek method, which is 200 to 50. Every time my left foot hit the ground is 1, just like a pace count when you're out doing land navigation. I would run for 200 paces and then I would walk for 50. And when I did this, I knew that my pace was around 12:15, because the important thing is when you go to selection or many of these courses, you're not going to be able to use a watch. So you're not going to know how far you went. You're not going to know what pace you're moving at. So having a structure like this, where I know if I run for 200 paces, walk for 50, I'm right around that 12:15 pace, I'm going to be good all day long. Then I can always speed up from there, but that's kind of my default that I go back to. And then ruck intervals. This is more of like a training thing that we can do inside of training. Like I said, if you're faster run times and you have that sub 13:30, if you have that sub 37, then we can include some ruck intervals where we run for a mile, walk for half a mile, run for a mile, etc., and get some additional stimulus with that. And then the big thing with this is don't lock out your knee. Kind of like what I talked about with the technique, especially going downhill, we do not want to lock out our knee, overextend our stride, and end up creating a lot of overuse issues from that. Try out different steps per minute. So some guys have a little bit longer stride, some guys take nice short and choppy ones. I recommend, again, split testing your steps per minute, figure out what works best for you, both time-wise and keeping your hip flexors nice and springy. But in training, I know we're talking about test day and incorporating strategies and getting the ruck runs and getting the interval rucks and all that stuff, but in training, the majority of our rucks should be walking only. We should only be including those rucks or those intervals, 1, when we have faster run times, and 2, when we're going into a peak phase before selection. If we're just ruck running perpetually, it will get to the point where it starts wearing you down and you'll start having issues with it, especially if you're going up in those heavier weights. If you're doing 25, 30 pounds, we can get away with it. But if you're going 45 dry, 55, 60 pounds, and you're trying to push that selection weight, do not be running with it on a consistent basis. With that, a lot of guys like to drive up the weights that they're doing. The weights that we typically recommend guys building up to and doing for the majority of their rucks inside of training is 45 dry, which ends up being about 55 pounds once you add food and water. If you're going up 75, 80 pounds, the return on investment is not there. It's gonna get a lot of fatigue from you. It's going to undermine the training throughout the week, undermine getting your run times down, and create a lot of potential for injuries. It's not a problem to do it once or twice or every once in a while to get a confidence ruck in and get some exposure with it, but we should not be carrying 75, 80 pounds on a weekly basis. Keep it to that build up and keep it to that 45 pounds or 55 pounds area. And then for a full rucking guide, which includes a sample structure on how to build up your rucking capacity and everything I talked about with specific conditioning, endurance capacity, and building your ruck performance, there's a link down in the description. Other than that, appreciate you guys watching. I'll see you in the next one.